morning, and welcome back to episode 12 of Lighthouse Health and Safety Podcast. I am your host, Andrew Chandran. Today's topic is on hazardous noise, or occupational noise management in the context of the prevention of noise-induced hearing loss at work. Now, last month I put a post out on LinkedIn on hazardous noise. And I started the post with a controversial comment, which was, earmuffs and earplugs do not reduce a person's noise exposure. And although a number of readers will understand what I mean by that comment, we did have a few others with a little bit of knowledge jump in to criticize that statement without fully appreciating the accuracy of it. And it is something we all need to be very cautious of when we engage a subject matter expert to help us manage a risk. We do expect that they do know better. And that post was very, very valuable because it highlighted how much misunderstanding there is around this topic. And if we do not understand what we're talking about, how are we going to protect people from noise-induced hearing loss? And the answer is we won't. So be very, very careful with the knowledge that you have, validate it, make sure you're doing the right thing. And this brings me to a quote just to start today's session. This quote is from Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. He was a Zen monk that passed away in 1971. And he says this: because all of us are doing the same thing, making the same mistake, we do not realize it. So, without realizing it, we are making many mistakes. And occupational noise management is like this. And the reason it is like this is because the average WHS practitioner out there does not understand the concept of noise exposure. And today I am going to bring you up to speed. But to start, we need to understand how we hear sound. And the way we hear sound or interpret sound is very, very complex and comes down to a number of components of the ear, starting with the outer ear or the external ear, which is effectively the organ that we see. That collects sounds, and the sound passes through the ear canal to the tympanic membrane, which is the eardrum. On the other side of the eardrum, as the eardrum vibrates, are the three smallest bones of the body: the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Now, these three bones conduct the vibration from the eardrum, and then those vibrations are sent to the inner ear, which is the cochlea. And in the cochlea is like a snail-shaped organ, which is lined with stereocilia. So stereocilia are basically hairs, and those hairs are connected to cells, and those hair cells line the cochlea, and the hair lengths correspond with certain frequencies. In other words, when the mechanical energy is transferred from the eardrum through those three bones into the cochlea, that vibration, that stimulus will stimulate the hair cells, which in turn creates a bioelectrical impulse which is transmitted through the auditory nerve to the brain, where the brain interprets those sounds, and that is what we hear. So when people lose their hearing and they get a cochlear implant, they need to learn how to hear again. It's not an automatic like-for-like process, and this is why it can be a very traumatic experience for people that have had a cochlear implant, as they learn from scratch to hear again. Now, in the case of noise-induced hearing loss, we really focus on the cochlea and the stereocilia, because when noise is loud, or we're exposed to hazardous noise over a period of time, or even impulse noise that exceeds the instantaneous noise exposure standard of 140 C-weighted decibels, then those hair cells can be permanently deformed. And when they're permanently deformed, they cannot vibrate effectively, which means they cannot propagate a signal through the actual cell body itself, then through the auditory nerve. So in other words, we become deaf. And that noise-induced deafness is termed noise-induced hearing loss, which is a compensable industrial illness. Now, just interestingly on that point is that because you have these hair cells which require nutrients through the bloodstream, if those cells themselves become poisoned, that can actually affect the propagation of the signal to the brain and can cause what's called chemically induced hearing loss. And there are various toxins that can cause that chemically induced hearing loss, and they are termed ototoxins. But for today's topic, we're just going to focus on noise, and we're going to leave ototoxins because that is just another set of hazards that will just complicate the issue. But you should be aware of them. Now, there are three types of hearing loss. The noise-induced hearing loss I discussed earlier, from hazardous noise exposure and ototoxin exposures, or what we call sensorineural hearing loss. There are two other types. Tinnitus, or tinnitus, is often described as ringing in the ears, and this can occur in conjunction with other forms of hearing loss. You then have conductive hearing loss. So that's a hearing problem that often involves the outer or the middle ear and may be caused by birth defects or physical trauma such as knocks to the head. With sensorineural loss, particularly noise-induced hearing loss, we are talking about noise exposure such that it causes permanent deformation of the hairs of the stereocilia that actually line the cochlea. And when those hairs and the hair cells are dead, they do not regenerate, they are gone for good. So that's a little bit of background on how we hear and what noise-induced hearing loss is all about. Now let's look at how we can prevent noise-induced hearing loss. And I'm going to start with the term hazardous noise, or the exposure standard for noise. There are two exposure standards for noise. One is a time-weighted average daily exposure standard, which is 85 A-weighted decibels, and the notation for this exposure standard is LAEQ 8H. That is the time-weighted daily noise exposure standard, 85 A-weighted decibels. There is also an impulse noise exposure standard, which has a notation of L peak, and that is 140 C-weighted decibels. Now I'm going to explain A-weighted and C-weighted later, and I'm going to put up a bit of a chart on this podcast so you can actually follow with me as I explain the difference. The exposure standard for noise is unique amongst all exposure standards, and what I mean by that is this. This is the definition of noise exposure. When we go to the regulations which call up the noise exposure standard, it will make reference to how noise exposure is measured. And that measurement is from Australian New Zealand Standard 1269.1. And within that document, it says very clearly that exposure to noise is determined at a person's ear position without taking into account any protection that may be afforded by personal hearing protectors. Now, personal hearing protectors are earmuffs and earplugs in lay language. Now, if you didn't understand the relevance of that information from ASNZS 1269.1, I'm going to explain this. If you take a noise exposure measurement according to the standard and just say that daily noise exposure measurement is calculated as 85 A-weighted decibels, And now I put in a set of earplugs, and you know what? I'm going to put on my earmuffs as well, so I'm going to have double hearing protection. Guess what? My noise exposure has not changed. It is the same with or without any personal hearing protection. And I reckon a lot of you listening now will struggle with this concept. And I'll tell you why you're struggling with this concept is because the noise exposure standard is not a logical standard. It makes no sense that personal hearing protectors are doing nothing. But because noise exposure is defined specifically to exclude any consideration of personal hearing protection, you can never report a person's noise exposure with personal hearing protectors in mind. They must always be excluded for the purposes of reporting a person's noise exposure. And there's a very good reason why the noise exposure standard is written like this, and give me a moment, I will come to it. But first, what is the legal duty on employers? Well, if we look at the WHS General Regulations 2022, Regulation 57, Part 2. A person conducting a business or undertaking at a workplace must, so far as is reasonably practicable, ensure that the noise that a worker is exposed to at the workplace does not exceed the exposure standard for noise. So in other words, a PCBU must ensure that the noise that a worker is exposed to at a workplace does not exceed an LAEQ 8H of 85 dBA or an impulse noise level of 140 C-weighted decibels without consideration of any protection that may be afforded by personal hearing protectors. Now, it doesn't say that in the regulations, but it does in AS/NZS 1269.1, which is referenced in that regulation. So the noise exposure standard, unfortunately, is not written for a lay person. It's actually written for a technical person, ideally someone that has had noise officer training, who knows how to conduct noise exposure measurements. But the legislation does have a massive flaw, which I've just only recently identified, and I'm going to talk about that right at the end in a small segment where I discuss personal hearing protectors in some detail. Okay, now, take a deep breath. I'm going to explain to you how noise exposure is measured using AS/NZS 1269.1. The first thing to understand is when we say exposure to noise, what does that actually mean? Now, if we go to AS 1269.1, it will say that exposure to noise is determined at a person's ear position without taking into account any protection that may be afforded by personal hearing protectors. So now we have to understand, well, what is the ear position? Now, when you take a measurement using a sound level meter or a personal sound exposure meter, the microphone must be placed at the person's ear position. Okay, and the definition of that location is this. With the person in their work location, the microphone should be located, whenever practicable, approximately 0.1 meter, but not more than 0.2 meters horizontally from the entrance of the external canal of the ear, receiving the higher noise level. So when taking a noise exposure measurement, the microphone must be 10 to 20 centimeters from the external ear canal, right? Now just think about this. That means you've got at least a 10 centimeter gap between your ear and the microphone. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never heard or never seen any sort of personal hearing protector, ear muff or ear plug, that extends out from 10 to 20 centimeters past the person's ear. Have you? No. And the reason why the standard is written like this is to force people to ignore personal hearing protectors when you determine a person's noise exposure. But like I said before, only a technical noise expert is going to understand that. The lay person reading the legislation will have no idea. So, and I reckon that this is the first time that anyone's explained to you technically why noise exposure cannot consider any form of earmuff or earplug. And therefore, my statement that earmuffs and earplugs do not reduce a person's noise exposure is 100% correct. So this brings me to the next part of the podcast, which is, okay, well, that's all very technical, Andrew. Most people who need to be able to comply with the law, they're not going to know that. And you're damn right, they're not going to know that. So, getting to the point of all this, how do you communicate noise risk effectively? If I was talking to someone that did not have that technical understanding, how do I communicate noise risk in a manner which is going to help them understand what their risk is so they can go away and do something about it? Okay. Now, for many people, the concept of noise level is a much easier concept to grasp than LAEQAH. Okay, and for example, hearing protector signage that you often see in a workplace is determined on noise level alone. It does not take into account the magnitude and the duration that people are working in the vicinity of that signage, just noise level alone. And 85 dBA is a common trigger for a workplace that's operating on 8-hour shifts to actually have their sign posting put up in areas which are 85 decibels or higher. That's not uncommon. It's not the correct approach because noise exposure requires a computation of magnitude and duration averaged over the 8-hour work shift. So of course, having a signage which is just based on magnitude alone, that's not going to cut it in terms of risk. It's just going to warn you of a hazard. The problem with 85 decibels over 8-hour shift is that according to Safe Work Australia's code of practice, and I'm talking about the Code of Practice for Managing Noise and Preventing Hearing Loss at Work. That's a 2011 document. It says that exposure to noise levels above 75 dBA is potentially hazardous to a small proportion of people, i.e. less than 5% of the exposed population. So actually noise levels above 75 averaged over 8 hours for a period of time may actually cause hearing loss to certain people, right? More vulnerable people, which means that, the 85 decibel level over an 8-hour shift is not going to protect everyone, okay? It'll probably protect maybe 95% of people. So the next question, what is a safe noise level? That is a poor question to ask because you should never determine noise risk based on magnitude alone. As I pointed out before, exposure takes into account magnitude and duration. So if you want to ask a question around noise risk, the question must be around how long can I be exposed to a specific noise level before it is harmful to my hearing? That is a much better question because it considers magnitude and duration of the exposure. Now note, until this point I've been referring to noise levels in decibels. That's because a sound pressure level is measured in decibels, which is a logarithmic unit. Okay, and I think the average person hearing that will not quite appreciate the importance of that statement. What a logarithmic unit is it effectively means that when you have small changes in decibels, you have an exponential change in sound pressure level. Okay, when we're talking about noise. So in real terms, an increase of 10 decibels, say from 75 decibels to 85 decibels, that 10 decibel increase is an equivalent to a 10 times increase in sound pressure level for the person receiving that noise. In other words, the hazard becomes 10 times what it was at 85 compared to what it was at 75. If you're exposed to 95 decibels, so that's now 20 decibels above 75, that is a 100 times increase in sound pressure level. The hazard is now 100 times higher at 95 decibels as it was at 75 decibels. This is very, very important. And this is how I communicate noise risk to a lay audience. I remember one day I was presenting to a group of drillers on their noise risks. And there was one individual who was doing some work on a genset, and the genset was producing noise at about 115 A-weighted decibels. And I was speaking to the person and I said, look, your daily exposure will exceed the 85 decibel exposure standard after just a minute and a bit working with that genset, right? And his face just lit up. And I sat in front of the whole crew and I was talking to them about their noise exposures, and I was just watching their responses quite intently as I was talking to them in decibels. Said, "Are these your decibels, levels? This is what the exposure standard is." And people like sort of nodding their head. Okay. My exposures are higher than the standard. Okay. I said, but I need to show you how much higher your exposures are than the standard. So what I did was I came up with this rule, which I call Chando's Rule of 10. And that is very simply, as I explained before, is if we take a reference level of, say, 75 decibels, right? And then say your exposure is 85 decibels. Well, that's 10 times higher than 75 decibels. So 10 decibels higher, it's 10 times higher. 95 decibels, that's 20 decibels high, so that's 2 zeros. It's 100 times higher than 75. 105 decibels, well, that's 30 decibels higher than 75. 3 zeros, that's 1,000 times higher than 75 decibels. 115 decibels that this individual was exposed to, that is 40 decibels higher than 75. That is 10,000 times higher than 75. So because this person was working at 115 decibels, the A-weighted daily exposure standard was 85. I said to him, you're 30 decibels higher than the daily exposure standard, right? You're experiencing a noise level of 1,000 times. 1,000 times 85, right? Which means that when you look at how long you can be exposed to that, that's like a minute or so. And that's it. Even if you're exposed to nothing else in the course of your 8-hour work shift, you have now exceeded your 8-hour exposure standard of 85 decibels from that one brief exposure. Okay, so this is the reason why noise levels must be reduced so far as is reasonably practicable. This is the reason why we cannot rely on personal hearing protectors, because they do not reduce a person's noise exposure for a very, very good reason, even if it might seem illogical. And now on your screen, I've just popped up some frequency response curves for the different weightings we use for noise measurement. You've got the Z weighting, which is a linear, unweighted measurement. That is the light green bar. It has 0 weighting across all the various frequencies. Here from 10 Hertz all the way to 20,000 Hertz. It's unweighted, 0 weighting. The C-weighted curve is the dark green, which has a bit of a negative weighting at both of the tail ends of the curve. And it's fairly unweighted through the center. So from about 40 Hertz through to about 2,000 Hertz there, it is unweighted on the C curve. Now the A-weighted curve is very interesting. So that is the yellow curve. You can see at the lower frequencies, so between 10 Hertz all the way through to about 800 Hertz, the there's a huge negative weighting, and what that is representing is that the ear is highly insensitive to the lower frequency sounds, with a negative 70 decibel adjustment at 10 hertz all the way through to a much smaller negative adjustment just under 800 hertz. You will notice, if you've got a keen eye, that between about 1250 hertz to about 4000 hertz, that the ear is slightly more sensitive than a microphone. Okay, and the reason why the ear is very, very sensitive in these frequencies is because these are the speech frequencies, and human beings are very communal creatures. We speak, we communicate with words, and those speech frequencies happen to sit in the most sensitive part of our hearing. Makes sense, absolutely makes sense. If you look at other animals, particularly prey animals, they'll be particularly sensitive at some higher frequencies that correspond with leaves rustling, twigs snapping, and things like that, which would indicate that a predator is nearby. So we are very much accustomed, our sensitivity of our hearing is very much accustomed to facilitate communication. But of course this means that because they are the most sensitive receptors in the ear, they are often the frequencies that we lose first when we're exposed to hazardous noise. So they are the frequencies we want to protect the most, but are also the most vulnerable receptors in our cochlea. Now what I'm going to do now is to just show you to simulate the sensitivity of the human ear on the A weighting curve. I'm going to compare how a microphone receives certain frequencies versus how the human ear receives certain frequencies. So I'm going to play two audio sounds. The first sound is what the microphone hears at a particular frequency, followed by what the ear hears at that same frequency. And we're going to start with 250 hertz. So at this level, the ear applies a negative 8.6 decibel reduction. So it should sound softer than the microphone. Let's see. This is what the microphone hears. This is what the human ear hears. That's 250 hertz. You can hear the obvious difference between the microphone and the human ear. The sound is much softer. Okay? That's because the human ear is not that sensitive to 250 hertz. Now, let's jump to 500 hertz. This is what the microphone hears at 500 hertz. This is what the human ear hears at 500 hertz. The decibel reduction at 500 hertz is negative 3.2. So we're getting close. We're getting close. In fact, if I was to put my technical hat on, I would say quite confidently that the microphone was twice as loud, or the sound energy was twice as high from the microphone. Now let's jump to 1000 hertz. At 1000 hertz, there is no adjustment between the microphone and the human ear. So it should sound the same. Let's have a look. This is what the microphone hears at 1000 hertz. This is what the human ear hears. Fairly indistinguishable to me. If your hearing is a little bit better, you may have noticed some difference, but I doubt that very much. Now at 2000 hertz, the ear starts to pull ahead of the microphone in terms of sensitivity. Here we have a plus 1.2 decibel sensitivity for the ear. This is what the microphone hears at 2000 hertz. This is what the human ear hears at 2000 hertz. Again, to me, they sound about the same. I can't really tell the difference. And finally, at 4000 Hertz, we have a +1 sensitivity of the human ear over the microphone. This is what 4000 Hertz sounds like to the microphone. And this is what 4000 sounds like to the human ear. So I hope that demonstration was quite useful to actually just show you that the human ear is particularly sensitive, and in some cases even more sensitive than a microphone, around the speech frequency range, which means we must protect that speech frequency range very, very carefully. Now, just out of interest, as I've dealt with several personal hearing protector manufacturers in the past, I will share with you important detail. If you look at the attenuation data for personal hearing protection, you will find that they tend to provide the least attenuation in the speech frequency range, right? Now, obviously that's the area that you want to protect the most, but they provide the least amount of protection in that speech frequency range. And it's a characteristic of the materials that are used, but also keep in mind that if you're protecting mostly in the speech frequency range, it means that you can't communicate very, very well at all. Which is no surprise that people tend to take out their earplugs or remove their earmuffs to have conversations in noisy places, right? So this is just another reason why you cannot rely on personal hearing protectors to protect your workers from noise-induced hearing loss. They are close to being ineffective. I cannot say ultimately they are ineffective, but I can say they are close to being ineffective because they are not noise controls. And indeed, they're not even noise exposure controls. Now, sadly, everyone is going to lose their hearing as they get older. This process of naturally losing your hearing is referred to as presbycusis, and that's going to occur. But if you're somebody that is also exposed to hazardous noise as a part of your work, it means that by the time you get to a comparative age with somebody who has not had that historical noise exposure, you're going to be in a much, much worse off state. So just for example, when an audiologist is trying to determine whether you've suffered noise-induced hearing loss, they will typically look for a pronounced loss of hearing at around 4000 Hertz. Now, as I've demonstrated with the sounds I played earlier, that is one of the frequencies that the ear is very, very sensitive to. So, of course, it's going to be one of the frequencies of hearing that we lose first. And this is the marker that the audiologist will be looking for in determining whether your hearing loss is noise-induced or otherwise. So you've probably been waiting for me to say, well, okay, Andrew, you can't use personal hearing protectors to reduce noise or reduce personal noise exposure, but obviously they do attenuate the sound that is actually reaching the stereocilia. Absolutely, absolutely they do, but we just don't know how much. We don't know if it's what it says on the box. We don't know if it's better than that. We don't know if it's worse than that. And that's why I say they are close to being an ineffective control. Now, let's look at noise controls as they're intended to be implemented to protect people from noise-induced hearing loss. Now, noise controls work by reducing a person's noise exposure. As I've determined, personal hearing protectors do not do that. So in a nutshell, noise controls reduce the magnitude and or the duration of exposure. And sometimes they'll change the frequency distribution of the noise as well, to sort of flatten off the more sensitive region around 1000 to 4000 Hertz. So remember, personal hearing protectors do not reduce a person's noise exposure, so they are not classified as noise controls. But other things are, things that reduce the magnitude of noise or change the frequency distribution from the noise source. Okay, so that's the generation of the noise. And then the other way you can actually control noise is to actually change the transmission pathway to the person. Okay, so what you can do to reduce the noise emission is to redesign machinery or use other processes which are not as noise intense. You can enclose machinery, right, or use vibration absorbers. The problem with enclosure and things like that is it adds in additional issues such as heat issues, maintenance issues, access issues. Right? I was once working on a offshore platform where we got a 10 dB reduction in calculated noise exposures through noise modeling, specifically from pipe lagging. Now, when it came to the commissioning phase and people were trying to access a lot of the pipes, the lagging got in the way. So what they do is they started removing a lot of the lagging during the commissioning phase. Really, really not good. And of course, that undermined a lot of the noise exposure modeling that was done for that particular project. Okay. Now, other than enclosures and using vibration supports, you can use noise absorbing materials on the internal surfaces of rooms or enclosures, or you can set up screens, and if you can set up screens that are at least the same length as the wavelength of the noise that you are trying to block, that is something that you can do as well. And you'd want to speak to an acoustic engineer so you get the dimensions of those screens correct and the materials correct. Now, you could also, instead of controlling the source, you could actually control the person to a good degree by moving the operator away. You could enclose the operator in a soundproof enclosure, right? You could rotate operators around to reduce the duration of exposure. The problem with job rotation is it's not always a very effective or pragmatic control. So controls that reduce noise generation and transmission is where you want to be. And remember, you have to do that so far as is reasonably practicable to comply with the regulations. The other thing you can do, which is quite effective, is buy quiet. So this, with your procurement teams, you need to have these processes in place when you're selecting suppliers of equipment. I've got a couple of really good posters I'm looking at here from NIOSH, which I'll throw up on the screen. It's common for construction workers to have hearing of workers twice their age. So for example, in this image, we have a 25-year-old individual with the equal hearing to a 50-year-old who has not been exposed to noise in their career, right? And then we have this other image on the right. Repeated exposures to noise above 85 decibels or one exposure above 140 decibels can lead to irreversible hearing loss. Okay, so buying a tool just 3 decibels lower will cut the noise energy reaching your ear in half. So remember I told you about the rule of 10? 3 decibel rule is basically if noise is reduced by 3 decibels, that's a halving of the hazard. Okay, noise increases by 3 decibels, it's a doubling of the hazard. I like to think of it in tens because I think it's a much easier way to communicate that to people. Now, you'll note that I haven't mentioned personal hearing protectors so far in detail, but we finally arrived at the pointy end, and it's time for me to do that. So what are personal hearing protectors and when do they apply? So if we look at the national standard for occupational noise, which is on Safe Work Australia's website, it's a 2000 standard. So it's been around for 26 years, not been updated for 26 years. That should tell you a bit about how many subject matter experts we still have in the policy making area. Not too many, okay? Now, personal hearing protectors, according to the national standard, are defined as a device or pair of devices worn by a person or inserted in the ears of a person to protect the person's hearing. That is the formal definition of personal hearing protectors. Now, that national standard, by the way, used to be quoted in former work health and safety legislation. So in other words, the definition of personal hearing protectors was actually defined in law in previous regulations. What I've noticed in the work health and safety general regulations and the offshore regulations here in Australia is that the national standard has now no longer been quoted. And that would be okay if the definition for personal hearing protectors sat in the regulations themselves or in Australian New Zealand Standard 1269. But guess what? You will not find the definition of personal hearing protectors in either of those regulations or the technical standard, which means we no longer have a definition for personal hearing protectors in law. And if anyone is listening to this, if anyone is listening to this, and I hope the regulators are listening to this, you should be very, very worried, very, very worried at that omission, because that is going to come and bite you massively. What it means is that if people are wearing personal hearing protectors at work, there is no longer a qualification for when you can use them in law. You just cannot use them, full stop, right? That is what that means to me. And if a regulator is listening to this, you better get onto this and you better fix this before all the PCBUs and their lawyers start applying for exemptions against the noise exposure standard, because it will come. Okay, so yeah, please get onto that and fix that quick smart. Now, although the national standard for occupational noise has not changed since 2000, the code of practice has, and it's a model code of practice, so it is not law because it's a model code. So unless that has been transformed to a state-based or territory-based approved code, then it won't become law. But you will have the approved codes there under the various regulations, or under the various acts, I should say. So according to the National Model Regulation, it says that personal hearing protection should be used in the following circumstances. When risks arising from exposure to noise cannot be eliminated or minimized by other more effective control measures. As an interim measure until other control measures are implemented, and where extra protection is needed above what has been achieved using other noise control measures. But interestingly enough, in the former National Code of Practice, personal hearing protectors were defined just as they were for the standard, but in the model regulations, they are not defined at all. Again, massive problem, massive problem. Okay, so regulators, please take note and get onto that. And just finally, to wrap up, how do personal hearing protectors actually work? So in simple language, personal hearing protectors may be used if and only if all engineering noise controls and administrative noise controls have been implemented so far as is reasonably practicable. Okay, so this is assuming that there is a definition for personal hearing protectors in the law. If they're not defined in the law, then they practically don't exist. So that needs to be resolved ASAP, that definition. So if you control noise exposure, right, and you're using personal hearing protectors, what they will do is they attenuate the sound energy that reaches the stereocilia within the cochlea. Okay, so these are the receptors. These are the noise receptors. The ear is not the noise receptor. It's the stereocilia that are the noise receptors. And when they are permanently damaged from hazardous noise, it can result in noise-induced hearing loss. Now, I mentioned before, I copped some flack from a few ill-informed people in my LinkedIn post last month on hazardous noise when I stated that earmuffs and earplugs do not reduce a person's noise exposure. By now, you can see that not only was my statement correct, but hopefully now you understand why that it is. And it all comes down to the definition of what is noise exposure. I hope that this puts you in a more informed position to now explain this concept to other people in your workplace, because it's going to be mind-blowing to many, many people. And you'll just watch as the light bulbs switch on when they finally get it. Okay, because we all need to do this. We all need to act together to stamp out the massive misunderstanding that most WHS practitioners have around hazardous noise exposure and its management. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Be well, stay safe, and I will see you later.